Good morning, gentlemen, ladies. Good morning. This is day 2 of the translational course. Enrique, you want to come up front? I can barely see people in the last row. Come up front. We'll make this more informal, interactive. This series, which as Stewart mentioned yesterday, this year we're doing in 3 consecutive days, addresses topics that ordinarily are not focused on in graduate training programs or startups, and so we try to fill the gaps in terms of what you need to know, no matter where you are in the innovation cycle, from idea to FDA approval and beyond. My talk this morning was mainly aimed at people early in the game, and it had to do with the kind of relationships, interpersonal relationships that can make or break a project in terms of the strength of the collaboration, how those relationships change over time as you go through the healthcare innovation cycle. But looking at the folks who are here, I think you probably have already mastered that part or not. I'm happy to go through it. So why don't we do that? Okay. Alrighty. Well, so my name is Steve Schachter. I'm the Chief Academic Officer for CIMIT. CIMIT stands for Consortia for Improving Medicine Through Innovation and Technology. We're Boston-based but global in our operations. We've been around for about 21 years now. We have received and given out order of magnitude $100 million in grant money, particularly to teams developing innovations in the area of medical technology, not so much drug development, but medical technology. And so we've supported and mentored hundreds of teams from early stages of translational research all the way through to product launch. For every dollar CIMIT has invested in a project over the years, there has been a 20 times multiplying effect in terms of follow-on funding. About 35 to 40% roughly of the projects we support are either in clinical practice or in clinical trials right now. So it's been a wonderful opportunity for us to observe up close the entire process of health tech innovation. And so we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, realizing that innovation is both a process as well as a thing that comes out of it. We have paid attention to the process. Our second speaker will talk a lot about how we've codified and formalized the innovation process in healthcare. But it's also about the people, the innovators. And what you see in the bottom right there is a healthcare kiosk that CIMIT helped a group in Singapore design, and which now is in many of the primary care offices and community living apartment complexes where a person can sit down and have their vital signs checked and so forth. So those of you who have climbed the Mount Everest of innovation in healthcare know it's a long journey. And particularly folks who start out young in the process, it's one that it's hit or miss in terms of if you're really prepared for it. I think the people that have been successful in part have been very persistent, lucky, and get back on their feet when they're knocked down and prevail. But it's a challenging multi-step process, very frustrating, and very few individuals can do it all themselves. Very few people have all the necessary knowledge, experience, and so forth to go the whole way up Mount Everest themselves. So collaborations with other people are almost always essential. And Mike Dempsey showed a version of this healthcare innovation cycle yesterday at another meeting. They called this the, what was it, the Wheel of Fortune. And most of you probably get into the innovation cycle at the very beginning, realizing what the unmet clinical need is, or you might have an idea and realize that it's related to an unmet clinical need, and you start from there. Others may jump in, later in the game. But nonetheless, it is a journey with fairly consistent stops along the way, milestones, nodes, whatever you want to call them. And each of those way stations provides an opportunity for the process to get off track. And again, at CIMMYT, we've seen teams get off track at all these places for all these reasons. And so the question is, well, how can we train, how can we prepare people to anticipate these issues and put together the team necessary to keep going and avoid these problems? And as Mike mentioned yesterday, and John will expand on in his talk, it's a journey that not only is in terms of developing your new drug or biologic or device or IT product, software product, whatever it is you're working on. It's not just about proving it's safe and effective, better than placebo. It's also about understanding what it's going to take to get the FDA to approve it. Whether doctors or whoever's going to prescribe it really think it's going to be a good thing or not. And whether it can be produced at scale, where the cost of goods are appropriate and so on. And these are all examples of the 4 domains which you have to travel simultaneously, the 4 different rings, simultaneously as you proceed from the idea stage all the way through FDA approval and clinical use. And as Mike mentioned yesterday, what we see too often is that a group gets way ahead in the scientific or technical realm, because that's what they like to do, that's what they're good at, that's what they know. They don't know necessarily what they don't know. So they get very far ahead only to find out that the regulatory pathway is such that they have to backtrack in their technological or scientific progress and redo and pivot and so forth. So our mantra is to proceed near simultaneously in all 4 of these domains. There's things you need to do, boxes you need to check, resources you need to avail yourselves of in each of these 4 domains for each of these technology readiness levels or nodes. And that's what's formalized in the GAITS product that CIMIT has produced that John will talk about in just a minute. But what this also again reinforces is the need for you, and I'm assuming most of you are either physicians or PhD scientists, what this reinforces is the need for you to have people you can collaborate with that have these other skills and experiences, regulatory, market research, or understanding the market, understanding who will need to approve this besides the FDA in order for it to become in clinical use. And also to challenge, if you're a clinician, to challenge your assumptions that you really have put your finger on what the unmet need is, and that what you assume your colleagues out there who would prescribe this eventually want to have. And it's a very humbling experience for people who consider themselves clinical experts, say in neurological or psychiatric diseases, for example, to go out early in this process and talk to colleagues and say, gee, what if I had a patch that I could put on somebody with epilepsy? You think that would be a good thing? Or whatever your concept is. validate it with key people who can who represent the prescriber stakeholder group. And we heard Mike mention a CEO of a company yesterday that continues to talk to customers. It's very, very important. I think some of us tend to be in ivory towers and we assume we know everything, and what we believe would be, you know, the hottest thing in Parkinson's treatment or whatever it is, we're sure our friends and colleagues will glom onto it, but that's not always the case. So the team that you put together is important. Now, yesterday we made the point that that the leader of the team needs to understand everything that's going on, particularly when it comes to the early stages, so that you can coordinate the efforts of the team. But recognize that you may not know things that are important to consider at a particular whatever stage you're at. So you need to build a team. I think most people tend to look within their own institution to find folks. At CIMMYT, we believe strongly in finding the best people, no matter where they are, to put on your team. We've seen that interinstitutional IP challenges and cooperative agreements and so on and so forth can be managed. And once they're managed, then you have the benefit of picking people that, no matter where they are, that can fill out your team. Also, we have software tools at CIMIT that enable people to collaborate through the cloud, and so geographic proximity, you know, is not as important as it may have been in the past. Recognize at the stage you're at what kind of help you need, and if this is not entirely clear to you, the GAITS program John will describe can inform you. Well, at this stage, this is the regulatory deliverable. This is what you need to do, and if that's something you're not capable of doing yourself, to then find someone. Well, now, what type of people would you like to collaborate with? They need to have a passion for what you're doing. Maybe they have a personal experience. I think that would be ideal with the disease that you're working on. That they ideally have a successful track record. You know, they've proven themselves to be good collaborators. Collaboration is not something that comes naturally to people, and what can make it difficult is that although we all may speak English, the different members of the team may have a different worldview, and sometimes understanding one another, particularly in engineering, I have found, can be a little challenging. But good collaborators, you know, find ways to communicate and communicate regularly. It's not like you tell somebody, here's what I want to develop, you know, do a market survey for me and then hand it off to me, or this is the widget I need, can you design it and give it to me in a year? We call that drive-by collaborating, and it's less likely to be successful than an iterative, ongoing collaboration process. You need somebody who has the time, but on the other hand, doesn't have all the time in the world. Busy people tend to get things accomplished. But as I say, somebody who really understands the problem that you want to solve, has a passion for it, because that passion is what sustains people through the, you know, ups and downs of development. It's not a smooth, straight line towards the promised land. This is often a difficult, frustrating process, and it's the interpersonal relationships and the passion for helping patients that can sustain you during those tough times. Very important to have written agreements in place with people up front. You're working on, particularly if you're at the idea stage or proof of concept stage, you're working on something hopefully that has the potential for intellectual property. because if it doesn't, it's going to be difficult to find anyone to invest in it down the road. And if it has intellectual property associated with it, then that means there needs to be people identified as the inventors on the patent disclosure or the application filed by your institution or by your startup. And that is typically what is licensed to a entrepreneur or to a company, has monetary value. So it's important to have written agreements up front with people who, to determine who is going to be an inventor on a patent and who, even if they're not an inventor on a patent, has contributed substantially that they should share in the downstream royalties. It's much easier to talk about these things and to come to an agreement about these things early on before there's any money on the table than later when there's a entrepreneur on the hook or your tech transfer office has identified a potential licensee. So it can be an uncomfortable conversation, but it's a very important conversation. And it's not like writing a paper where you just put people on as authors who may not have necessarily participated in the creative aspects of the paper. You can't have inventors on a patent who didn't truly contribute to the claims. If it's later challenged, it can be invalidated, which is a disaster. So it's important to have people who truly are the inventors on the patent, but that doesn't mean that those are the people who are, that it's restricted to those people who would benefit from future royalties coming back to the institution and then the inventor share or the laboratory share. You can have a written agreement in place with a collaborator who may not be an inventor, but with whom you want to recognize their contribution anyways and make them and share either the laboratory or the inventor share of any downstream royalties. Another aspect of IP, as many of you may know, is that you can't publicly disclose it before it's protected. And so in academic environments, this is causes a tension because you want to publish quickly, you want to get the academic recognition for that, but the risk is that you may then publicly disclose what would have been a patent or the gist of a patent application and therefore invalidate it. So when you're picking collaborators, make sure they understand this, particularly if they're in academia, that we may not be able to publish this experiment for a couple years. That runs counter to the usual academic mindset of publishing, disseminating knowledge as soon as you have it. I mentioned that it really takes a multidisciplinary team of people to move a product all the way. And the specific people involved at the beginning are usually not the same team, maybe with the exception of the original creator, inventor, usually not the same team that finishes it, simply because the ownership of the product may have changed hands during that period of time to an initial licensee. Perhaps that group was acquired by somebody else and so forth. So realize that you're not necessarily going to stick with the same people you engage with early on. You're not necessarily going to finish with those same people. What does that mean? It means you have to, if you're the sort of leader of this whole thing, you need to, it's your institutional memory that's going to help cement the continuity of this all the way through. And I've experienced this several times where you have a wonderful working team and all of a sudden now it's been a new entity owns it with their own people and they take it over. It's a fact of life, and you just have to, it's like your baby, grows up to a certain point and off they go. But you can still, expect them to bring you their dirty laundry to do. So now, who else do you need? You may need project managers, mentors, tech transfer officers, entrepreneurs, and so forth. And finding these people, if you're new to the game, can be a little challenging. Those stakeholder groups are all represented at the ASENT meeting here. We at CIMMYT run something we call the crash course, which takes teams that are working on a project and teaches them what they need to know at whatever stage they're at. And over the course of a few months, helps the team gel and understand where they are in the innovation cycle, what they need to do to further de-risk it to the point where people who want to invest in them would be willing to do so. And the nice thing about this crash course, which stands for Commercialization Readiness Assessment and Accelerator for Solutions in Healthcare. All of our acronyms are thanks to John Collins here. The nice part about that is the team works together throughout the course to do their work. So they do it as a team. They, in so doing, get to really understand whose role is what and work side by side with 9 or 10 other teams who are also going through the same thing. So there's a sort of a shared camaraderie that takes place. And the teams that participate in the crash course usually include an entrepreneurial lead, so the business person, the clinical lead, and a technical lead. And they receive mentoring through a group of seasoned medical executives, Mike Dempsey's accelerator team, that help each of these project teams navigate the healthcare innovation cycle. So there are a number of topics. I'm sorry, question?
You said to be a little more informal.
Yes,
So
please.
I'd ask a question. Is it just going to work when I... can you go back one slide?
Sure.
I'm just going to... Or one more. I'm going to put a plug in here for... so you've got all these different cross-functional folks on a team, clinical, marketing, business, regulatory, technical, and a lot of others. But who is the subject matter expert that's bringing all those people together, putting them in the meetings, making sure they're staying on topic, and getting to the conclusion that you need to? I'm coming from program management,
Yeah.
and when I show something like this, I put program management right in there with all of those guys. Or
Yeah.
we just aren't able to get, everyone together at the table. So I was just wondering, like, when you take a look at this model, the slides here, you've got them listed, but if you don't have a solid program manager, it's been my experience, it's difficult to get all of them at the table.
I think that's true. The program manager is there, but it's... personally, I think that because the whole process starts with defining the clinical need, and typically that definition comes from somebody in the trenches, seeing patients, families every day with a particular problem. They really, so they have a up-close and personal understanding of what more could be done for people, for patients. And hopefully they have the passion to see it through the whole way. Typically, I think the clinician is the center of the team, but may not have the project management skills that you're referring to, which can be extremely helpful. Now, in Boston, we have one of our sister organizations, which is an NHLBI-funded translational research program, has project managers that do a wonderful job. It's not a readily available resource necessarily, particularly at the very early stages. And as a not as a good substitute, but as a substitute for it. What John will show you in terms of the GAITS program provides a roadmap, at least so that teams know what they need to do and where they need to go. Now, who makes it all happen operationally? Ideally as a project manager. And if your institution can make somebody like that available to you, it's terrific. but it's not a given. I mean, unfortunately.
Yeah, Steve, if I could just jump in, I think that's a really excellent point, because one of the key things about this is we're not talking about the roles on the team, we're talking about the expertise that's being brought. So we're talking about the expertise being brought. So certainly program management's important, communications is important, having a finance person is important, all of those things are important. But let me push back a little bit on the idea of the program manager as being the one that stitches it all together. For us, there's a difference between leadership and program management. So program management typically is responsible for managing to expectations, and leadership of a project is about creating expectations. So I think it's really important to have that program management skill there, but that has to be coupled with kind of who's leading the activity, which, you know, it's kind of the passion often of the clinician that's really driving the activity forward. So that's that balance.
Alrighty. So I was just talking about the crash course, which CIMMYT has run probably 6 or 8 of these here in the States, over in Europe. We run these for NIH. So we've adapted a lot of existing resources in creating the crash course. You see some of the topics that are discussed. You certainly don't have to go through a crash course to be successful, but the GAITS program, John will show in a second, is sort of the backbone of the foundation of the crash course. But the advantage of this for teams going through is that they have very close contact with an experienced mentor, somebody who's, who wears the bruises of their commercialization, healthcare commercialization experience, and who is willing to give their time and effort and expertise back to a team. It culminates in pitches and then funding applications, and many of the teams are quite successful at raising money to move their concept forward. Now, primarily this has been done in the world of medical devices, diagnostics, and not drug development, but you may come across other training programs at your institutions with similar concepts as it relates to drug development as well. So if anyone wants to contact me, there's my email address. You want to learn more about CIMMYT or about GAITS, which John will talk about now, or about the crash course, or about our funding opportunities. The solicitations that CIMMYT puts out are national calls. We just finished one for NASA about innovations for the astronauts on the mission to Mars. Kind of cool. We're in the midst of a solicitation for the NFL Players Association, a football health study that you can find information about at CIMMYT.org. It's not just about head injury, but it's about endocrine and a variety of other neurological conditions associated with American football. So invite you to learn more about CIMMYT and contact us. But my advice to those of you who are just starting out in this area is to pay as much attention and diligence with who you collaborate with as you might in picking a spouse or in a good friend, because it's more than just about the technical expertise. It's really it's an important interpersonal relationship that can make or break a project, and anticipating the stresses on that relationship can help you get through them. I sound like a marriage counselor, I guess, but it's important. And these relationships that you form on one project can come back in another project. I mean, it's kind of interesting how folks in drug development, they bring their product to market, then they want to work on the next one and the next one. And so it's once you are familiar with who does what in this area, it'd be easier for you to identify potential partners and collaborators to work on your project and help make your baby improve healthcare one day. Any other questions on this topic? Comments? Enrique, do you have any? Neil, any words of wisdom? Anyone want to share their own experience in lessons learned in terms of collaborations? Again, don't feel like you should be restricted in choosing collaborators from your own institution. While it can make things easier, you know, in terms of confidentiality and so forth, you want to get the best, you want to put together the best team possible, no matter who they are and where they, you know, are based out of. And it can work, and you can have cloud-based collaboration tools that can make it possible. We've had project collaborators in Singapore, you know, halfway around the world, 12 hours difference, and you know, it can work. Okay. All right, so then let's bring up our second speaker, John Collins. John is the Chief Medical Officer for CIMMYT.
I just got a promotion.
Oh, I'm the Chief Medical Officer. Actually, I'm not. I'm the Chief Academic Officer. Who cares about these titles? He's the Chief Operating Officer. Haven't had enough coffee yet. And John is a mechanical engineer by training. So to him, the brain isn't just yet another black box. And he came to CIMMYT with a lot of experience in industry, overseeing product development cycles. Joined CIMMYT about 8 or 10 years ago now. And he has, along with Mike, led the effort to look at CIMMYT's experience over the years in supporting hundreds of project teams and trying to figure out, approach it kind of academically. What were the predictors of success for those teams, and how can we help teams that may be destined to get off track, if you remember that earlier slide, how can we help them keep on track? And they've developed this really terrific free tool called GAITS that you'll learn about, you're welcome to use. And no matter where you are in the healthcare innovation cycle, it can be of benefit to you. And it doesn't only apply to medical devices. With some variations on the theme, it certainly applies to drug development as well. So this is actually the first time that we can make this tool available to you for free, which is kind of exciting. And to talk more about it, John Collins.
Thank you, Steve. This presentation is going to be a bit like, I guess, Book 5. Can you hear me now? Is that a little better? This presentation will be a bit like Book 5 in Game of Thrones or Song of Fire and Ice. We're going to start a little bit before where Steve had presented, touch on that, and then finish up later with what the GAITS tool is. So first, I think many of you may know, what is CIMMYT as an organization. It's a very unusual organization. It was started by Dr. Parrish, who's still very active, 20 years ago, as a collaboration between a number of Boston institutions. And at the time, you can imagine 20 years ago, well, some of you can, many of you can't, translational research was a death knell viewed in a Harvard system. If you're not doing absolute cutting edge, if you're doing translational work, you're not going to get published in Nature or premium journals. Of course, that isn't correct. And Dr. Parrish really focused on the need to help people that really wanted to see things get to patients, provide an environment where you could bring together the engineering world and the technical world to help advance the technology into clinical practice, as opposed to just advance and create new knowledge. Dr. Parrish was successful in then bringing together a number of different groups across the Boston ecosystem and demonstrate the value of providing a collaboration vehicle where you can get an engineer from MIT, an MD from BIDMC, bring them together and have a new seizure detection algorithm, which is one of Steve's projects. And over a period of time, people recognized that Boston is a pretty unique ecosystem, and we were approached by different groups across the U.S. or across the world and across the U.S. and say, hey, wait a minute, our region has really strong hospitals and we've got great universities, but we don't have that kind of economic growth that's happening in Boston. Can you help us create that economic growth? And that's what we've done. But I think one of the key things I do want to make sure that we keep an important distinction is that Simmons Focus is not about research. May sound a little bit odd. So we define the process of research of taking money and translating that into dollars. And we see innovation as being just the reverse. It's really about taking the knowledge that has been created in a wide variety, not just medical knowledge, but knowledge in the automotive space or aerospace, wherever, the engineering world, and certainly turning that into money, but more importantly, turning that into value. So that's something that will be a constant theme, that so many people, particularly in healthcare, are coming out of the research environment, that they treat innovation the same way that they treat research. And they're two different animals, so you're not surprising to know that that doesn't work. So CIMMYT's mission, really, at the end of the day, is we've got a lot of dots. Our mission is to connect those dots. So we're a virtual organization. All of the work that CIMMYT supports is being done in the labs distributed across the globe. So as Steve mentioned, our mission is to accelerate the healthcare innovation cycle to improve patient care. That's our metric. It's not how much money is made, how many papers, it's how many patients are touched. There are many, many ways of doing that. Our focus is on facilitating collaboration amongst the stakeholders. So clinicians, technologists, entrepreneurs, and companies. And we do focus in health tech, both products and services, but as Steve has mentioned, many of the methods that we've developed have been applied in drug development as well. So this is what we like to describe as the CIMMYT model. It's the 4 Fs. First, our mission is to help find really good problems, really important unmet needs that, if addressed, will make a difference in many people's lives. And then find teams, technologies, et cetera, that may be able to address that particular need. So it starts with understanding, where are the valuable problems? We're fortunate we get funding from a wide variety of sources, from, Steve mentioned, NASA, NIH, the Football Players Association, DOD, to solve important problems for them. So we bundle our solicitations to a wide variety of forms, but typically there are $100,000-ish awards and then several $100,000-ish awards, which in the healthcare world is not a lot of money. So our mission typically is to be able to get your technology, your solution, to the next stage where you're ready for whatever the right vehicle is, an SBIR funding or an NIH grant, whatever or financial investment in particular. I think the most unique thing about CIMMYT is the facilitation, so that we engage experienced entrepreneurs to assist teams manage commercialization risks so that patients benefit. And this is really, I think, gets back to the question around program management. So these folks typically bring that combination of program management and leadership to understand, how do you take a science project and put it in a way where it's on a disciplined path. You're addressing the high-risk items, you're being able to present it properly, you're delivering on time. You don't go off on tangents just because there's something interesting that happens along the way. And these are the team that Mike runs. So these are people that have started companies, managed companies, exited companies, and they get in and roll up their sleeves. And they're not just business folks. I mean, these folks, you have to, in this space, have to understand the technology, have to understand the medicine. Not that they can practice it, but they've got enough experience and knowledge. And starting about 10 years ago, I think the other thing that CIMMYT does that frankly I've not seen anyone else do is follow. And by follow, I mean really look at and study, quantify and study the process of innovation in healthcare. Why would we do that? Well, if we think we're doing a good job, how do we do a better job? And we'll talk more about that, and that's really the genesis of this GAITS platform. I don't need to go through examples. You guys know examples. So going to the following part, really we put CIMMYT under the microscope about 10 years ago to understand what works and what doesn't work. We started with a first clinical impact study where we looked at about 230 solutions. So these were, I think, a mix of about 600 projects. Some of it was phase 1, phase 2 projects. Some of it were different projects that came together. So we contacted over 600 different teams and asked what happened. We looked at input metrics, how much money had gone into this project before CIMMYT got involved. What's the seniority of the team? Those sorts of questions, as well as what happened as a result. Did you get into clinical practice? Did you get the follow-on funding? Did you have publications, et cetera? And we looked at statistical correlations to identify areas to study. I won't go through the gory details available on our site, but one of the things I wanted to point out that was quite a surprise for us, particularly because early on but the reason it was a surprise is of the 230 solutions that we studied, more than a third were commercialized. And we're starting with early stage technology. That number is extremely high. And the thing that was probably most surprising was that of those that were commercialized, 85% of them were still in business. And for those of you that know the startup world, that's really an exceptional record. And we believe the reason for that was Dr. Parrish's insistence that we focus on things that met an unmet need, and therefore was creating value, as opposed to just something that was nice to have. As Steve mentioned, the other thing that we really learned was kind of the process where most people think that innovation is easy. You had this great idea, and the world beats it to your door, versus, as Steve explained, you've just started on a very, very challenging journey that you're not prepared for. And I really like this mountain climbing analogy, because let's go back for a second and say, what are the attributes that make a good mountain climber? Well, they plan, right? And they've got their tools, and they practice both with the individual tools, but they practice with their team to make sure that they know the skills and strengths of each one of them. They develop those skills, and then they execute. They get in the mountain, and then they adapt. They find out what works, what doesn't work. So they either succeed or fail, and they learn what to do next time, and they plan and go through the cycle over and over again. Well, if I'm doing a 100-foot climb, I can do 10 of these cycles in a day, and I can learn pretty quickly. But we think the same elements apply to innovators. And again, if I'm in Silicon Valley and I'm working on an app, I can go through this cycle in a year, 6 months, 2 years. If I'm doing medical devices, it takes me much, much longer. So the issues in healthcare is that this cycle of learning through practice doesn't work as well in healthcare. As you know, cycle times can be 10, 20 years that you're working on. And how do you learn this when there's no one teaching you? You can work on many times you're only working on incomplete cycles. You never know what actually happened at the end. And many times you learn things you think you learned, but you actually learned the wrong thing to do. And you practice that because you don't get the feedback. So that's true. I think the issue is being an entrepreneur or doing this work of commercialization is hard in any industry. There's no question about it. But we believe it's significantly harder in healthcare. So you look at some of the challenges of buying dynamics as an example. In most industry, the user is the buyer. So I can talk to the user and say, would you buy this? In healthcare, the user of a product or service is very rarely the buyer, and often it's hard to figure out who the buyer is. Well, then how am I going to set the price? Same thing with the reimbursement complexity. It's the user who pays what something is worth. Well, this could be worth an awful lot to the user, but a reimbursement says it's only worth X number of dollars or Y number of dollars. So you've got to understand that dynamic. The regulatory pathway, there's regulation in every industry, but in most industries it's pretty clear cut what standards you need to make. In healthcare, it's much more difficult to understand, and the influence of the early decisions on your regulatory pathway are much higher. The other thing, I came to CIMMYT working from a number of different industries in automotive, health, consumer products, et cetera. And generally speaking, in most of the other industries, the culture is, let's give it a try. Let's throw it out there, see who likes it. Well, in healthcare, what's the culture? Don't screw up, right? Don't hurt anybody. So the culture in healthcare is everyone wants to innovate, but no one wants to take any risks. In funding requirements. In most industries, you can get a product to market for an app for 100K or a device for single-digit millions. In healthcare, it's an order of magnitude more. So again, being an entrepreneur, getting things to the market is difficult in any industry, but we find it's particularly challenging in healthcare. And one of the things that we see in healthcare is this issue of the valley of death that so often we often hear about. And most people describe this valley of death as just no money in the translational research space, right? And actually, in looking at it, we don't believe that's the case at all. If you look at where is public funding? So public funding happens early on, and the basis for public funding is scientific merit. How unique is your idea? How much knowledge can be created? But then you look at private funding. So that's kind of the commercialization world. The basis of funding there is on the investment potential or the impact potential. Very, very different. So really, the valley of death is nothing more than where the basis of funding decisions change. So one of the key things that we've tried to introduce with GAITS is while you're doing your not so much basic research, again, that's around creating knowledge, and it's about how do you, when you've made the decision to do translational research, or now you're in the innovation space. And the idea is how do you do that work in a way that you understand what the commercial value is? And that's what we try to do in GAITS, is to be able to help people as they're using that public source of funding to get ready for doing work in a way that when your results are there, it's not just showing that your technology is better than something else, but showing that you've got something that's worth investing in. So for us, this is a really important concept. And unfortunately, so many folks in the healthcare space are coming out of academia. They've had no training in innovation or commercialization, and they're treating translational research exactly the same way that they've treated their basic research. And I think most of us recognize that the valley of death today is getting more challenging. So there's less funding on the translational side, and many of the commercial funders are looking for things that are more mature. So navigating this valley of death today is indeed harder. So some of the key lessons that we learned in that study is, first and foremost, innovation in healthcare is a learnable, teachable process. I hope you realize how important a concept that really is. And that many, if not most, frankly, early stage teams, including startups, have no training in innovation. Many times there's training in entrepreneurship, so you understand those sorts of things, but not really any training in innovation. As a result, they don't know what they don't know, and they just make mistakes without understanding that they've just doomed their project. And that learning, as I mentioned, learning by trying in healthcare is very, very difficult. And often there's the key assumption that a novel technology will be a commercial success. Well, it's not. It's the combination of an important unmet need, so it's not a technology looking for a problem, and having a commercially viable solution. I just came from another meeting where a lot of the discussion was around, all of these projects have these great outcomes that you can demonstrate, but they're not being commercialized. So how do we work more with the healthcare systems to adopt these ideas that where you've got very good clinical results to show something works? And I was kind of the unwanted guest at the party to say, well, how do you know that that particular solution is commercially viable? How do you know that that solution, just because it does work in a number of cases, is worth the hospital's effort to be able to provide that service or solution? So again, having good outcomes and good science is critically important. That's threshold, but it is just not sufficient. So the way we've worked around it is that actively facilitating teams, importantly, before you give them funding, as well as during funding, with experts in the process, significantly improves the commercialization success rate and speed, and also provides a very efficient learning by doing it right. A lot of projects will fail. That's just the nature of science. But if teams can learn the right methods as they go through this, then the next time they're more likely to be successful, et cetera, et cetera. But facilitation is hard to scale. I mean, the team that Mike has assembled has over 250 years worth of experience. They're willing to give that experience to teams, but when they're working one-on-one, they can only work with one team at a time. So the question that we had at CIMMYT is how can we capture CIMMYT's experience, and not just the experience of our own team, but of the network that we have? How do we capture that experience in a way that others can use it? Well, as Steve mentioned, I'm a mechanical engineer and believe in Six Sigma. Said, all right, well, let's define the process, and then we can improve it. We can measure, and we can improve that process as we go forward. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history to the healthcare innovation cycle. As we looked around and asked the question, all right, what process do we use? We wanted something that was, we didn't want to create something new. So we looked around and said, what can we beg, borrow, and steal? And the concept of technology readiness levels was one that's pretty well adopted. Have people heard about TRLs? About a show of hands? How many people know what a TRL is? So you're the commercial folks, okay. So TRLs, it was adopted by the or developed by the Department of Defense and been used by NASA to look at what is the maturity, what are the milestones from basic science, TRL1 through something that's in clinical, or that's used in the DoD. So that's great, let's use that, but now obviously the language, we need to change this language to work in healthcare. So with support from the NIH, we went back through and modified that language and created language specific to therapeutics, devices, and diagnostics to help people in healthcare understand where they were in that maturity level. But as we looked at it, we said, wait a minute, there's a problem here. We're about innovation. So one of the things we said is that really we want to adapt the TRLs to the health tech innovation. So we're going to start with our experience. You don't start with the science, you start with a need. So we replaced the TRL1 with science and really looked at the whole research process as a separate process from innovation. The other thing that we recognized is that the TRLs stop at 9, which is use. And we said, well, that's nice, but in healthcare, your job isn't done until your solution has become the standard of care. So we added a 10th level, and then this is the language that's been used for what we call health techs. That's kind of where the engineering world meets the medical world. But as Steve said, that wasn't sufficient. One of the things we then did is said, listen, we know that to understand the clinical need, you really have to understand the standard of care. So this whole cycle really is grounded in understanding what is the standard of care, both because you want to be able to extract the clinical needs, but also as you move forward, you should always be focusing on the question, will this change and improve the standard of care? And if your answer to that is no, you shouldn't move forward. So if your answer is, can I get more funding? That's a very different question than will this become the standard of care? So Steve mentioned this is the process that we identified. We thought we were set. This is great, we're clean. And as Steve mentioned, we looked at it, and in our retrospective study, we tried to understand why there are so many technologies and teams that we thought just had really great solutions, great promise for improving care, but didn't get into commercialization. So we studied those failures. And as Steve mentioned, they failed for a wide variety of reasons. The frustrating thing is a lot of the reasons, not all, but many of those reasons were unforced errors. So Steve mentioned someone released a paper before a patent was released or was issued or was applied for, and as a result, no funder or no financial funder is going to put money in it because there's no patent to protect it. My bet is for a lot of those situations, the individual that made that decision to publish was not around in the discussions to understand why there was no commercial investment, and all they got was a no. So the investor didn't realize that he or she made a mistake that ended up undermining their innovation moving forward. So that's where we developed kind of the next version, really to prevent unforced errors. And as Mike likes to use the term de-risking, what we're trying to do is each and every step of this process, what can we do to identify the biggest risk and knock that risk down so that we can move forward. And the key concepts is, as Steve mentioned, you follow a series of milestones. These are generally based on the TRLs. As best you can, you synchronize your work by completing deliverables in each one of those milestones in 4 domains. Again, as we talked about before, the team members required to provide these deliverables will include a wide variety of individuals, program managers, finance people, et cetera, et cetera. We get a lot of, so in an ideal world, even though we're on the East Coast, we're strong proponents of the Stanford biodesign methodology, where there's a significant amount of work that goes into observation of standard of care to be able to identify and articulate clear important unmet needs. But the reality of today's world is many of healthcare innovations are being funded as science projects by the NIH. So these teams come to CIMMYT at proof of feasibility, proof of value stage, and looking for funding. So what we do at that point, we say, listen, let's pause for a second here. Let's go back and understand all of the deliverables that you should have had before and whether or not there are any risks, any things that we need to do to backfill before we move forward. So again, it doesn't mean you have to do this from the beginning to the end, but wherever you start, you do need to take stock of what's happened before, because you don't want to move forward on a false or a bad set of assumptions. The other thing that we try to do is use language which is more consistent with innovation, and we do this in our proposal. So in academic, hypothesis-driven research and languages around aims, objectives, and outcomes. So what we try to do is use more innovation language, so kind of the parallels of milestones, requirements, and deliverables. Our awards are grants; they're not contracts, so there are no hard deliverables, but we treat them as if they were in the commercial world. Now, so this is really the first that you've seen of what we mean, and I can't read the things in particularly well. At the end, I'll show you where you can get a copy of this document. So you can imagine that the healthcare innovation cycle is really, it's a 4x10 matrix, right? So there are the 10 milestones, and then within each milestones, the 4 domains. So what we've done, this is something that we've used for a couple of years, is identified what are the deliverables that a team should have at each one of those milestones to say that they've completed and move on to the next one. So let's see, for example, under number 2, idea, on the clinical side, you should have a clinical workflow description. You should have an unmet need statement. You should have feedback from more than 5 clinicians. So very tangible things that can take you 5 minutes to do, or some of these deliverables will take you 5 years. So this is not meant to be, again, it will be very different from one organization to another, one project to another. I think the important thing also to recognize is that what we've done so far in terms of fully codifying things is focused on health tech. And we're in the process with Steve's helps and others to basically create mirror documents for pharmaceuticals, biologics, health IT, apps, because the concept here of the 10 milestones and 4 domains, that concept stays absolutely the same. The deliverables will vary, both by industry, and generally speaking, they don't vary much by location. So developing a product in Europe is not that much different from a milestone-based perspective than developing one in the US. How you do a particular regulatory deliverable is going to be different in the US than it is in the EU, and we'll talk about how we help teams understand those differences. So this particular resource is available to you. It's on the website, and you can, a little hard to see, but the checkboxes are either there's no activity, or this is a deliverable we're currently working on, or this is something that is complete. So for us, when it used to be a team would come to us and say, I need help, Mike's team would spend hours working with them trying to understand where were they, what were the gaps. Well, at this point, we can say, great, we'd love to talk to you next week. Here's a form, fill it out, and let's talk. So the team spends numerous hours, and it takes 5 minutes or less. Usually there's some tweaking that needs to happen, but very quickly Mike's team can understand where they are and focus on the bigger value add of, all right, what should you be doing to move forward? So this resource for us was really a powerful resource. Telling one story on the side, as Steve mentioned, we've used this across the world, and we had one meeting not too long ago in Barcelona, where we had the first meeting with a team that had just gone, same thing, here's the form, fill it out, and let's come in and talk about how you're going to move forward. So this big burly guy comes in off of his motorcycle, his leather jacket, he's got his helmet on, and he's huffing and puffing. I'm thinking, uh-oh, this is not good. He sits down, looks at me and scowls and says, I got to tell you, I'm really mad. I said, I wish I had this 3 years ago. I wouldn't have wasted my time. So it's pretty amazing when you look at kind of some pretty simple concepts that when people get so locked in on advancing their science and not recognizing that advancing the science is not the same thing as advancing a technology. So with the success there, we've invested in making this resource available to others. So our objectives for this, what we call guidance and impact tracking system, it's a web-based platform with the objective of scaling the delivery of expert facilitation and training for teams. Our hope is that the results will be higher success rates for teams that use it, faster time to market, and train innovators. The other thing we want to do is measure the progress and impact of teams in a real-time and consistent way. Why would we want to do that? Well, first, we want to improve the efficiency of reporting and reviewing. For all of you, for anyone that's been involved in managing a portfolio, many of our NIH colleagues or other colleagues, I've got all these cats and dogs of projects. How do I know? Well, each one has its own set of aims, objectives, and I've got to kind of get into each one of them to understand where they are. And how do I roll up where things are? And these teams will write reports, frankly, very few people ever read. So how can we make that reporting process both more valuable to teams as well as more valuable to portfolio managers? And that's what we try to do with GAITS. And the last thing, and I think the thing for us, which is frankly the most exciting thing, is to the potential of innovating innovation with best-in-class organizations. You can imagine when we get thousands of projects that have been documented their progress, we'll have a fairly unique database to objectively study the process of innovation in healthcare and understand why groups from this cohort or that cohort do better than others. Again, this is the nice thing about healthcare. This is one of those rare things where I think everyone's sharing what best practices are to help another team improve healthcare. I think everyone shares that objective. That's generally why they're in healthcare.
John, could I make a comment?
No.
So one of the things that may not have been clear, but I think is pretty cool about the GAITS system is it's independent of the process that you use, right? So it's milestone driven. It's not process driven. So you could say we're going to use the Stanford Biodesign process or the Lean Launchpad process or, you know, my tech transfer office's process. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, though, you're looking at milestones and outcomes. So as we gather more data, hopefully we're going to be able to say, well, you know, the Stanford Biodesign process really excels at, say, the front end at, you know, customer discovery. And, you know, process X really works well for the middle section when you're trying to execute on the science, and process Z really works well at the end when you're trying to do final licensing or whatever. Right now, no one can compare that data because everyone there's no control arm, right? Everyone says, well, our system works, we have an X funding rate or we have a Y commercialization rate, but they're not comparing that data to other projects that they chose not to fund or it had a different process. So this is part of what's going to make, hopefully, GAITS an industry-wide source of data and comparisons.
Yeah, and in addition to that, for portfolio managers, in real time, being able to look at a project and say, hey, this is getting off track, as Steve was mentioning. What can we, and rather than just flag this is getting off track, if you can do it in real time and say, hey, what can we do to help this team get back on track? So this is a screenshot of what the platform looks like. And again, you recognize the 10 domains or 10 milestones and 4 domains. This is a screenshot of some dummy data, but fairly typical. Just ask yourself, if you were looking at this, do you know anything about this project? In about 10 seconds to say, yeah, boy, they've done an awful lot of technical work, and you know, they obviously have no one from a market perspective, and they've done a little bit of regulatory work. You know, this is a tech push project. So very, very quickly you can see where it is. And the idea being that for each one of these cells in which there are deliverables, a dark color means that you've completed all the deliverables in that cell. A shaded color means I've started deliverables, but I haven't completed them. And obviously gray is that I haven't started them at all. So again, the objectives behind GAITS is to provide guidance. So we provide the guidance through what are the deliverables, and then what are some resources that you can use. Again, to Mike's point, we don't want to be prescriptive about how you do a freedom to operate analysis or a needs description. But we're going to give you what we consider to be best-in-class resources, pointing to Stanford Biodesign or whatever. Over time, you'll see we hope to not have our judgment being used, but use social media to find those resources that people actually find most useful. At the same time, doing planning and tracking. So this view right now is tracking what happened. But now teams can use this to basically plan their work and say, here are the deliverables that we're going to be moving forward with. And we've built this into our application process to help teams understand what are the things that we'd recommend that they do with their next pot of money. And being able to do reporting both at the project level and at portfolio level. And again, hopefully at the end of the day, our major goal is to analyze, study, and share best practices. I think a critical thing with this is understanding that there are two types of data that we'll be capturing within a GAITS site. One is kind of parametric data. When did you start? When did you stop? There's really nothing confidential about that, particularly when it's anonymized. And then there's content about the specific project. That data remains completely confidential to the teams. And the construct here is that each team gets its own site. But then we have something called a portfolio site where, for example, in this case, we're running a program for NIBIB that's looking at point-of-care technologies. So the NIH faculty have their site where they can look at everything that's going on. Within that, there are 4 centers, one at Johns Hopkins, one at Northwestern. So they get to see everything under their portfolio, and they can have different proposal calls. So this is our cohort in 2018. This is our cohort in 2019, et cetera. And under that are a series of team sites. So I'll focus on the team sites. So the team sites are private information. The only people that get to see that are the people on the team and the people in the portfolio above them, but there's no crosstalk between teams. And this is, for us, this is a big idea, and we felt the only way that, as Mike mentioned, this can become an industry standard is if we involve as many organizations as possible to include their expertise. So this is a snapshot, and we really welcome anybody that wants to participate in this process to be able to provide us guidance. We're trying to create an industry standard and be as open as possible. So I'll just show you some screenshots for what this looks like, and at the end I'll point you to it's actually gaits.org. So GITS.org is a site where you can use this particular functionality. It's a public site, so it doesn't have all of the team functionality, but it has the important elements behind it. So the idea being is I can click on a milestone or a cell. When I click on the milestone, I will see here are the 4 domains, and these are the deliverables that I'd expect in each one of those 4 domains. There's a little progress icon, so for a team that's actually entering data, very quickly you can see the status of where everything sits. When I click on one of the deliverables, so in this case it's the clinical workflow description, I get a screen that says, all right, this is what the deliverable is, this is why it's important, and frankly for a lot of folks that don't know what they don't know, it's helpful for them to understand the context of why a deliverable is important. And then a very brief description of how to go about completing that deliverable. And then the option for the private team sites to be able to put in planning data or tracking data. And the things here are pretty straightforward in terms of start date, end date, the documented plan, and on the tracking, similarly, start date, end date, what happened as a result, what's the status. And also what's very important is it turns out this has been one of the most, the highest excitement attributes of this particular approach. The little box in the bottom right, which is upload a document. Teams we work with are really smart, but they're awful at record keeping. So a new team member comes on board and he or she has no context for why decisions were made 10 years ago or 2 years ago or last month. So that requires the person that's leading the activity to be the expert on everything. And also in talking to a lot of funders who want to come in and understand where this team has come from, this provides a structured way where they can go back and do their due diligence, particularly VCs or angels or VCs. So that's for a team to be able to plan and track their work. But again, I think one of the excitement elements, because of being able to work with teams where we don't have time to physically work with them, at the bottom we have curated resources. So these are articles, templates, websites, et cetera, that we think are really good at helping teams complete this deliverable. And I really want to reinforce Mike's point. We're not going to tell you how to complete this deliverable. If you like methodology A or methodology B, go ahead and do it. All we're trying to do is be able to see if you've done the work. And on the right-hand side, we've got a number of filters. So as I mentioned, doing a regulatory analysis in the US or submission is different than it is in Europe, is different in Australia. So you can identify resources that apply to my geography. We get a lot of funding from the DoD. They've got some of their own requirements. So US, they can say, I'm looking at a product which is appropriate for the DoD. What are some of the unique things that the DoD will be looking for in order to help this particular deliverable? Or if I'm just looking for templates, examples, articles, we'll be curating those. And again, we're early stage. We're focused on resources for health tech. And it's a little hard to see, but there is the social media function for teams to be able to vote on, did I find this particular article useful? And we'll have a function soon for people to upload resources that we will take a look at and include as a resource if we think it's sufficient. I won't go into the impact page, but again, I can understand and map my process, but if you're going to be able to improve a process, you need to be able to measure a process. So we've identified 3 buckets that we feel are pretty good in measuring the impact that an innovation has: clinical metrics, knowledge metrics, and commercial metrics. On the clinical side, it's how many patients are impacted and how many sites are using a solution. Would love to get into more detail around the severity, but this is one of those practical things, is what can you measure? And based on our experience before, it's really hard to do more than understand about how many individuals have been touched, be it in clinical trials or in commercial practice. So as you click on each one of these, we used to ask how many patients were impacted, and there'd be fights on teams, 342 or 426. Doesn't matter. So is it between 100 and 500, 500 and 1,000? So it's something that's meant to be pretty quick and easy for a team to give a judgment without being precise. So those are again, this is all you can see online. And again, because of the hierarchical structure, when you're doing your milestones and reporting, all of this automatically rolls up. So you don't have to create a whole new report. You can basically, a portfolio manager at any point in time can understand the status of their portfolio. So my last slide. For your own journey, that you can go to GAITS.org and you'll be able to see this healthcare innovation cycle. You'll be able to click on any of the milestones or cells, and you'll see the deliverables that we recommend, and you'll see the resources that we have curated, and you can download them, use them, whatever. And again, we're really looking forward to any feedback on this tool, and hope it helps you or your colleagues. And we look forward to any feedback. Importantly, there's a feedback button on here. So if you see a bug, you have a question, you have a suggestion for making this tool more valuable, we're eager for that feedback. So we've got about a few minutes for questions.
Can we have that last slide for just a second, please? John knows that I'm an editor of a journal, and so I'm an obsessive-compulsive person when it comes to finding spelling mistakes. So to keep me in practice, he always inserts at least one spelling mistake into every PowerPoint presentation. GAITS? What the heck is that? Oh. Good, okay. That's just an inside joke. All righty, excellent. So hopefully you can appreciate that GAITS can be, quite helpful for a number of different people. Project managers can use it to help keep track of multiple projects. A team can use it for a particular project. If you're the science officer or program officer at NIH, you can, in your funding a large portfolio, you can use it to keep tabs on that. If you're applying for funding, if you're a team applying for funding, you can use this to figure out where you are, because if your project is not as mature as what the RFA is calling for, you need to work on it before you apply. We build this into our own grant application process because we are looking for projects at a particular stage along the innovation cycle. If we see a team like this that's way out ahead in the technology, but hasn't done their homework in the other 3 domains at the same level, that's a worry for us. On the other hand, particularly if what they hope to do and what they propose to do with our funding is to further move their technology around. No, they need to use the money to backfill some of these other areas. So it's helpful for applicants, it's helpful for funding application, for funders, and at gates.org you have access for free to a lot of the functionality. We do have additional functionalities if you're interested, and you can talk to John about how to get that additional functionality as well. So let's open it up for comments, questions, observations. Some folks here who have been successful in this journey, would you like to make a comment? Or, sir, go ahead, please.
Oh, I'm actually going to ask a question, so maybe somebody else wants to give a comment first.
Sure.
Well, I guess I can just start. Thank you for both of your talks. My name's Adi. I'm an epilepsy fellow at Stanford, and I've had the privilege of going through the Stanford Biodesign class. What my question for both of you was, if you start using these methodologies, whether it's biodesign or using the GAITS tools from the beginning, it's fairly easy to get that into the culture of the team. But if you were to join a team that's already kind of along the way, can you give some insights about how you can bring these ideas to them without stepping on their toes?
Yeah, good question. I think big boots.
It's hard. I'm joking a little bit, but I think you have to be pretty aggressive about the concepts if you're passionate about them, and find ways of demonstrating that this really does work. And particularly if you can find errors, something that screwed up. Say, you know what? Had we only done this, we could have saved ourselves 6 months or a year or whatever. But
Your question makes me think that anyone in a position like you find yourself who wants to join a team should look for a team to join where folks are amenable to being exposed to this type of an approach, or who already practice it. But if you sense that they're going to be of the mindset that we know what's best, and come hell or high water, we're going to do it our way, maybe it's not a team unless you're forced to join it. Maybe it's not a team that you want to hook up with. CIMMYT often finds itself being brought into a process with a team when they have a profile that looks like the one that was just on that last slide. And they want our help, or so they say. So when we then introduce these topics and how we could help them, they not always want our help. And therefore, we don't always want to work with them. I mean, it's, it takes two to tango. I mean, we have limited time and resources, and we want to work with teams that want to learn from us and adapt if necessary. But some people have such a stronghold on their idea or their new drug or their target, or I'm trying to make this therapeutically relevant, and they don't want to give up any control whatsoever to somebody who didn't have the idea in the first place, and so good luck to them, is all I can say. And some of them will be successful, but some won't, for the very reason that you may find it difficult to be on that team.
Thank you.
So you're in a wonderful environment, and I think hopefully you can find, I've got some friends there I can point you to if you're looking for exciting projects to work on in epilepsy. But I think it's a good point. If you are being asked to join a team, not the one who's forming a team, if you're being asked to join a team, and your objective is to try to help move this to patient care rather than just sort of learn and get the experience, then you want to do your due diligence on who's inviting you and who else is on the team. There's just, just because they're down the hall from you, or, in the next lab over, or whatever, you heard a presentation from them, doesn't necessarily mean that that's a team you want to join. Life is too short. It's going to take you a long time to get a solution to the marketplace, and you want to be still around to see it benefit patients and do what you can to ensure success. So, good question. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Enrique.
Steve, his question actually opened sort of segue to my question, which is, have you guys ever looked at the psychology of a team? Because in my experience, I've seen great projects that fail because of the, let's say, interpersonal issues within a team that just the whole thing just crumbles. Even though you give them all the tools,
Yeah.
somehow the team doesn't move forward. Have you guys looked at the psychology of a team and what makes a
Not
a
formally.
good team?
Yeah, not formally, but I think that's on the horizon for us because that's so important. You know, we have our no jerk rule. We don't like to work with jerks. I mean, it sounds crude.
No, actually, it's, the real version is much more crude, so that's the nice version.
But you know, everyone is. You've all worked with people on different projects, different, you know, ideas and so forth. So you know that it's easier with some people than it can be with others. And there's a huge amount of non-scientific personality and, you know, disorders, issues that come into a team environment. You know, this is my idea, so my way or the highway. Unwillingness to give up control, like we just mentioned.
But I do think generally what first there was a study not too long ago, a bunch of looking at VCs and how they make their decisions. 50% of them say the number one issue is the evaluation of the team. And of course, you can't have a good team that doesn't have a good project, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the issue is on teams are really two major components. One are the skills of the team, which are pretty easy to understand. The other is what is the culture, and that you know, unless you experience it, my experience is unless you know what that culture is. But I would say we get to see that within a pretty short period of time. You can see how the interactions are, whether or not people are encouraged to speak their mind. You can see that pretty quick. It's not a formal study, but you can get a pretty good sense. I'm sure you've all seen that.
You know, in startups and business, there's something called the founder's effect, where you know the person that founded the company eventually becomes the impediment for the company continuing to move forward. In many cases, and likewise, I think the founding scientific person or medical person needs to give up control eventually. Needs to, you know, for commercialization to take place, and that can be difficult, particularly for certain people. So yeah, I think eventually we'll have a. If any of you have taken that thing called not personality, but there's this process you can go through that help you understand what kind of person you are, and you get a graph, and there is a science behind putting a good team together. We haven't quite reached that stage yet, but only at this point to make sure you understand that that's an important element of the whole process. It gets easier as you get older because you've had the experience of working with everyone's a good person, but you've had experience of working with people who make it easy and fun to work on projects and who share your passion and like I say, may have a personal family situation with Alzheimer's or epilepsy or whatever it is, and understand how meaningful this will be if this comes to market eventually. But then we've also worked with people who, again, try to even have stayed in academics, but try to hold on to their idea and their process as long as possible. And when, from an academic point of view, when the IP is licensed out to a startup or a company, is an important consideration. And if you try too soon, you may not be successful at getting investment. If you try too late, the train may have already left the station. There may be some other products in development that will get there first. So a stubborn, possessive, dominating innovator in an academic setting can kill a project simply by holding on to it too long. And that's too bad, because if it had merit, it could potentially help patients. Well, it won't.
I think the other thing, which is kind of recognizing the practical reality, is that 99% of the time you don't have all the resources that you want. So you can't have all the team members that you'd love to have. And that's part of the reason for GAITS, is to be able to help teams that don't have a regulatory person or whatever say, these are the things that you should find out about. So if all we've done is to say, here are the things that you don't know about that you should worry about, as opposed to, I don't know what I don't know, we think that's a significant advance. And if we can give smart people some resources, they won't be as good as having a real regulatory person, but they can begin to ask questions and understand that that's a risk.
Anyone want to share war stories with collaborators who turned out to be conspirators rather than collaborators, or problems? I see a big smile back there. So we invite you to check out the GAITS.org website, look around, share it with colleagues. I think this is exciting for me because this is the first public meeting where we're able to say it's publicly available. I think, ASENT, the purpose of the mission of ASENT can be mapped along the entire healthcare innovation cycle, from supporting early stage ideas, early stage innovators, through industry uptake of the technologies into patient care and what patients need. So it's a process, that's germane to the society and important for us to support. So with that, we'll conclude. Thank you very much. The business meeting starts in just a minute. You're welcome to stay for that, and hope the rest of the meeting is good for everyone. Thank you. Tomorrow morning, part 3, 7 o'clock, we're going to hear from FDA and NIH. They're your collaborators too, believe it or not.